Before we get started, I would like to read our land acknowledgement. So I just, let me pull it up. So to truthfully acknowledge our site's history and present experiences, it is important to recognize the beginnings of this place. So we take this moment to acknowledge that the history of our site does not start with Europeans. The town of Ridgefield exists on the ancestral homelands of the Ramapo, Munsee Lenape, and Wishquaisquek people. They were the original stewards of this land on which the Keeler Tavern Museum and History Center stands today. And we thank them for their strength and their resilience in stewarding this land. And we hope to continue their legacy of protecting this site and its history. All right. So thank you for that. And now we'll shift east some more and head over to China to talk about the origins of tea. We'll start at the very beginning, I guess. So just some quick background on tea. All the tea that we drink is essentially one species of plant, just different varieties. And it's an evergreen shrub that's native to Southwest China. It's called Camellia Sinensis. So that's the Latin name. It started primarily a Southern Chinese practice. The first credible record dates back to the 3rd century AD as medical texts. Although the Chinese do have mythologies about the origins of tea dating back to like the 28th century BC and things like that. So yeah, but it was popularized around the 700s in China, and it started spreading around to East Asian countries. But the Europeans and later Americans don't really get around to finding out about tea until the 16th century.
I love reading about the early 16th century, early 17th century into first encounters with tea. One of my favorite ones was the Duke of Monmouth's widow sent a pound of tea to a relative in Scotland without indicating how to prepare it. So the report says that the cook boiled the tea leaves, threw away the water, and served the leaves as a vegetable like spinach. You know what? We'll go with it. But it's like, you think it's a very simple way to prepare tea, and then you think about it and you're like, no, somebody had to show me that I have to boil it and then drink it this way. And you're like, that guy tried.
Yeah, I did find some references like that early colonists also did the same thing, like they would eat the tea leaves. But by the time Europeans were really settling in America, tea had really been around in Europe for a while. So I don't know how apocryphal those stories are. I think, Europeans had experience with tea for about a century by the time we kind of really get settling in North America. So someone should have kind of absorbed a little bit about how to prepare tea.
I hope they learned their lesson, is how I will end that little tidbit of information. Do you want to talk about how tea was brewed and served? Because I see a beautiful placement at Keeler Tavern on your table next to you.
Sure. So tea, so before we talk about how it's brewed, I just want to say a little bit about how you actually process tea, like off the bush. So basically all you do, tea is the leaves from the tea plant. But as soon as you start picking them, they start to wilt and oxidize. And the various types of tea is basically how long you let that oxidization happen. So you stop oxidization by heating up the tea leaves. So green tea is the least oxidized. It's stopped either with steam or by dry roasting the leaves, and that'll give you, and you do that sort of within a day or two of picking it. If you let it go on longer, then you get oolong tea, and if you let it go on even longer, you get black tea. And then there's other processes afterwards, where they're rolling the tea leaves and sorting them, and then you can ferment them, that's where you get like pu'er, which is a fermented tea. So you have all sorts of different types, but they all come from this one leaf. And the way you make tea is you basically rehydrate those leaves in boiling water. So that's kind of the mythology in China, that the first tea was made when a tea leaf fell into a pot of boiling water that this emperor god was drinking, and that was that. Now we have tea. So in the 17th and 18th century, as tea is coming to Europe, you do have different types of tea available. So I just want to, so I do have actually, so I have my cup of tea here, and it is a colonial blend, a colonial tea that would have been available to our 18th century ancestors. I found there are some people who who do sell. So I'll kind of move that forward. It's called a colonial buhi. That's how you pronounce that. B-O-H-E-A is pronounced buhi, because it's a mispronunciation of the transliteration of the Chinese version. So it's a tea from the Ui Mountains in Fujian province, which is right on the coast near Taiwan, in China. And it was the most popular tea available to people in the 18th century. That buhi actually became like a slang term or a genericized term for tea. So the way we say like Kleenex instead of a tissue, buhi means tea. So sometimes you see in records and things buhi, and that just means tea. It doesn't necessarily mean buhi tea. I promise I'll only say this once. It's not really my cup of tea. It's kind of smoky. If you like lapsang souchong, you might like this tea. It's a little less smoky than lapsang, but it's pretty smoky, so it's not really my thing. It's better with sugar and milk, which the people in the 18th century would have done as well. So there are a couple other teas that were available to people in the 18th century, and they're actually some of the other types of tea that were destroyed during the Boston Tea Party. So we have a souchong, which is actually not a particular type of tea, but it describes the type of leaf. It's like a very big leaf. So it's not a very high quality tea. In tea terms, the smaller the leaf, the higher the quality. And then another really popular but more expensive tea was called Congo or Congo, which is actually from the Chinese gongfu, which means skilled, because these tea leaves are twisted up before they're cured. And then, so it takes a lot of skill or gongfu to actually twist the leaves without breaking them. I also you can buy the same one from Oliver Pluff. I bought some of their Congo tea. It's much better than the buhi, just in my opinion. It has a little bit of taste like apples.
Ooh.
So yeah, I very much like that one. And then another common one, which is a green tea, is called Haisan, which is named after a British tea importer, Philip Haisan. But that's probably the most expensive tea. Green tea doesn't travel as well as black tea, especially if you're taking a long multi-day journey by boat. So green teas were a lot more expensive for people to purchase in Europe.
Yeah,
so
and
lots of
these
different teas.
voyages were about 2 years, right? Round trip, something like that, depending on how many times you had to stop or the winds or storms and stuff like that. So when you're talking about traveling, it's not how we would take a flight to Europe, maybe. This is you're leaving for a while, you're coming back later. You're leaving your kids and they're coming back as teens kind of a thing. So when we say things don't travel well, things did not travel well. It's interesting. I was reading about how to brew tea and how they're blended, and it's kind of like putting wine together. Of you have to have the right amount of flavoring and the quality of the tea, and there's a really big science behind it, because I was like, yeah, I like iced tea, that's great, but I didn't realize like how much of a process it was to get the tea in the first place, which is my nativity in the whole situation. But it's interesting, and how blending is like such a skilled art form, and how not many people know how to do it, and how long it takes you to get to that expertise of understanding how to blend it together.
Yeah. So one of the things about blended teas that is interesting, blended teas are kind of a Western Europe thing, an American thing. And really it's a legacy of British imperialism, blended teas, because once tea becomes popular in England, the British government allows the British East India Trading Company to establish a monopoly in trading teas out of the East, out of Asia. And so they do that for a while, but it's actually, they have some issues, because the Dutch are not, there's also the Dutch East India Trading Company. The Dutch government is not taxing any of the imports of tea coming into the Netherlands. The British are taxing heavily. It's like 25% the value of the tea that's being imported. So Dutch tea is so much cheaper. There is so much smuggling going on that the British East India Company just can't compete. So what they end up doing is sneaking tea out of China and into India. And they just set up their own tea plantations, growing Chinese tea in India, but also Indian tea, Assam tea, which is an Indian variety. And then from there, as the British East India Company loses its kind of market share, its monopoly, all these British tea importers kind of start encouraging people to buy Indian teas rather than the Chinese teas. And one way they do that is to really play up all the mechanization and industrialization going on on British tea plantations in India, and really kind of promoting this cleanliness. They're being overseen by an educated British man, as opposed to Chinese teas. They're, these poor Chinamen, they're dirty. And so really kind of shifting that focus to India. And then there's further, they start this blending process to really kind of obscure the place of production from the final consumer. And so now we hear about like Earl Grey. I see people talking about Lady Grey, Earl Grey, that have all these other flavorings blended in. That part of it is to kind of obscure that original production. And nowadays, at least in Europe and America, most of the teas you see are Indian teas. You don't really get Chinese teas. very much. So that's kind of a legacy of this imperialism of the British.
Yeah. That was a great overview in a few minutes of British imperialism that I'm like, you did what college professors take months to do.
Yeah.
There's always an impact for all of these kinds of things, and it's still affecting today. Like you said, how most people have this weird blend that they don't fully understand, and where all those undertones are coming from and how everything is mixed together. And
yeah, I mean, I still love blended teas. I'm not saying they're like bad, but I think one of the things we need to kind of be aware of nowadays is where our tea is coming from. You know, in the 19th century, the British East India Company and then later other tea importers like the Liptons and the Twinings and those big names we still know of, they set up plantations. They called them, euphemistically, they called them tea gardens, but they were plantations. They were designed and based around American and Caribbean sugar and cotton plantations. And today, those same plantations, they're not run as plantations. They're much more often owned locally, but they're still kind of beholden to these big multinational corporations. So part of the reason we chose December as tea for our topic to be tea is because tomorrow, December 15th, is International Tea Day, which is a day where tea producers in India and Sri Lanka and all over the world are really advocating for more clarity in tea production, and more transparency in tea production, better wages and working conditions and things like that, and just bringing awareness to this. So that's part of the reason why we chose December to cover tea, because I do think it's an important part of tea, is knowing where it's coming from and who's making it and things like that.
Absolutely. I think it's a very important topic, and I'm glad that we were able to cover it. But Catherine, that was really inspiring. It's always good to know. I mean, it's like the farm to table trend, and it's ever so important to know where everything is coming from. How transparent is it, basically, of where things are coming from? Is it sourced sustainably? Is it done properly? Is somebody being taken advantage of, essentially? And you want to make sure that you don't make that terrible impact. And we're all kind of learning, but it's good that we're making this kind of awareness on a tiny little scale that we can with our wonderful audience that comes every month, and we are so happy.
But I think related to that, back in the 18th century, a lot of tea drinkers did know exactly where their tea was coming from. A lot of teas were also named after the places they're coming from. So like, as I mentioned before, Buhi, that kind of most popular tea, is named specifically for the Ui Mountains, where that particular tea is grown. So, back in the 18th century, people did know. And so I think getting back to that awareness is really important.
Absolutely. There's no good segue from such a topic, so we apologize in advance. But do you want to talk about the cup that you're drinking and how you're going to drink it?
Oh,
and knowing where your tea comes from, because we know where that one came from.
Yeah. So tea in Asia has a lot of ceremony surrounding it, and when the Europeans discovered tea and were made aware of it, they kind of picked and chose, what parts of the ceremony they wanted to replicate. But there is a lot of kind of special cups and saucers and teapots and everything that went along with it, like a whole service. Obviously, we kind of know about a tea service. But related to that, you do end up getting, over time, teacups change shape and things like that. So let me share my screen because I have a really fun little, hold on. So when tea first comes to Europe, the Chinese are actually selling not only the tea, but the teacups that are to be used with that tea. And so even once Europeans start producing their own teaware, they mimic that Chinese teacup shape. So you can see right in the front and center is the Chinese shaped teacup. If you've been to a Chinese restaurant, you're probably familiar with this shape. And it's, as you might know, it's handleless. And one of the reasons that the Europeans continued with this handleless shape is it's easy to ship handleless teacups. If you stack a bunch of teacups with handles, guess what's the first thing that's going to break off? Is those handles. So we start with the Chinese shaped teacup, and then people start, experimenting and developing different shapes. So from the Chinese shape, or it's often called the common shape. So in inventories and things like that, they might be called common shaped teacups. And then you get a butte shaped teacup, which was it didn't really take off in the United States. It was more popular in London. You don't really see them around. And all the teacups on my table here are one of these shapes, but I do not have any butte shaped teacups. The next most popular was the London shape, and that's when you get on the outside this kind of little corner to it, and you start getting a little more flair, which I really like. That kind of, it's a little different. It's a little easier to hold than a perfectly round one too. You have little handholds. And then you get the double curve, which is just fancier. And this is when the potters are becoming more and more skilled in making these molds too. They can really do these fancy things. And then finally, by the 1850s, you get this tulip-shaped teacup, which becomes the main shape of the teacup up through the 20th century. And they're still kind of the most common shape you find in hotels and things like that, is this tulip-shaped teacup. So just wanted to share. So we do have a lot of different, as far as I'm aware, and as far as my reading shows, there's no like benefit to one shape or another. It's just whichever one you prefer, whichever one, was popular at the time. And then the other
shape
thing,
of the London one was really pretty. Yes. I don't think the ones that we have on display are as cute. I can show them to everybody. I was trying to figure out which ones I have, and I'll share my screen of what's on display, because I was looking at that, trying to compare it to which ones we have, and I don't. That's got a curve on it, I think, right? So that's got to be pretty fancy. Yeah, we've got some fancy teaware, but that's got a really cool curve on it. And I was trying to compare your little image. Maybe a London, right? Maybe.
Yeah, well, I think those were like the most popular ones you hit the 19th century. So more than likely.
Yeah. Those are the ones that we had on display in our Clinton room. So we had a very cute tea set, and I'll show a little bit more just in a bit.
And the other thing I think people are know about, with a teacup, you have your saucer, right? And 18th century saucers and 19th century tend to be really deep compared to modern saucers. So if you look at this, it's like, you know, it's pretty deep. And part of the reason is it's just that's the way they were done. There is this kind of myth that people would pour their tea out of the cup and into the saucer to make it cool down faster. It's called saucering. And I know it was kind of common practice in Russia for quite some time. But as far as I can tell, it was not common practice in the United States. Or if it was practiced, it was frowned upon. It was not considered like proper or good manners. So let me see here. So let me share my screen again. So you can see this is like the only image of someone I found saucering their tea. It's this satirical print from Britain called The Old Maid, done in 1777. And also in doing readings of people writing, a lot of travel writers who were visiting America really commented on tea and the tea culture in the United States. And they kind of make a point to say that in the US, people are not drinking tea out of their saucers. Like they make this a point to say that they're not doing it. And they really emphasize part of the reason people say that you would saucer your tea is to make it cool down really quickly and make it easier to drink. But these travel writers are really emphasizing the fact that Americans like their tea like piping hot, that they're going to drink their tea really, really hot. So it doesn't make sense for them to saucer their tea. So I thought that was kind of an interesting thing. It is a myth that has kind of perpetuated a little bit. And I do think it is kind of a fun fact, but
why we like iced tea so much, Catherine?
Yeah, I don't know. I think that's a modern invention. So
I love everything about this. I love the cat. I love, oh, what a beautiful, beautiful painting.
Catherine, could I just interrupt? There are two questions which really relate well here. So
sure.
One is, when did tea bags start to be, to become a thing? And the other one, why did Russian tea sets have mug-like glassware for tea? So they're in the chat. They're the last two.
Okay. I think Mary, you know about the tea bags, but I did want to address the Russian tea sets. I don't actually know. I did not really look much into Russian tea culture. I know they kind of got into tea before the Western Europe did, just because of their proximity to China. And they kind of have their own special thing going on in Russia. But yeah, that's a good question. I don't know why they use like mug-like glassware, maybe just to be different.
That's the only answer we're accepting tonight, because they wanted to be cool and different. As I was looking through New York City as this kind of like tea center of the tea universe at some point in time, I kept seeing the same person inventing the tea bag, and then I found somebody refuting it, and it was like, actually not quite. So his name was Thomas Sullivan, who allegedly invents the tea bag in 1904. Because he was sending out little sample packets to encourage more business. So he was sending them like, it's the holiday season, so we can have like little tiny gift sets of like, here's 5 flavors for you to try. And apparently it did work. Like he was sending out these tea bags, but he was not the person to invent it. But I mean, like, great business strategy. I actually found the patent for the bag here. So this was actually patented by Lawson and Mary McLaren of Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 1901. So a few years earlier. So they went there. It's their technical patent. They're the ones who hold the patent for it. And it's really, I mean, it's economical because instead of buying a whole pack, and I'm not a good tea drinker, I have admitted it, but one of my best friends is like very into this, and she does like the loose leaves and a whole science behind it. I am okay with a very easy, like occasional Lipton bag. So I understand having it pre-measured and pre-done. It's a smart idea, and I'm really glad that somebody came up with it. But it very much reminded me of, I'm going to go back just a little bit, of Paul Revere's. I was showing this to Catherine earlier today. This little silver shell was used to measure tea, and it was one of my favorite things that I was able to find off of the research, because Paul Revere as a silversmith is amazing. And then finding his like full tea set, and then finding this little tiny measuring cup that is absolutely adorable. So very happy, but I can see how using this measuring cup is a lot more cumbersome than having a pre-selected one, and also being able to buy like a variety sample pack to like encourage business is a great selling point. So early 1900s, to answer your question in a short and long way. a little measuring cup is my favorite.
Yeah, so for anyone who is interested in drinking loose leaf tea, the general rule of thumb is 1 teaspoon per person, or per serving of tea. So that's kind of the general rule of thumb. It does vary based on the variety and how strong your tea is and how strong you like your tea. But that's general today, and that's actually the general rule from way back in the 1700s as well. So I did find from, it's 1800, but I imagine if it's been published in 1800, this is kind of general practice before that. It's in a book called Domestic Management, and it describes how you're supposed to make your tea when you have guests over, right? Because tea is a social drink. You're supposed to drink it with other people. And so they talk about how you have to make sure your teapot is the right size for the number of people you have. So like my teapot, I have a modern teapot here that I've been making my tea, and this holds 2 servings of tea. So it's perfect for just me. But we do have lots of different sizes of teapots. So you got to make sure your teapot is the right size. And then it's 1 teaspoonful is sufficient for each person to have 3 cups of tea, which is the general quantity drunk by each. So they're assuming you're going to have 3 cups of tea when you stop over for tea, for afternoon tea. And then what you do is you pour your boiling water in your teacup, into your teapot, and until it's 1/3 full, and let it stand for a little bit to brew. And then you're going to have a really, really strong tea. So you dilute it with another, so you then fill the teapot with more boiling water to reheat it, but also dilute it to a good drinkable strength. And then you kind of just keep doing that. You pour out 1/3 and serve it. And then when everybody's ready for round 2, you pour in more water and kind of keep doing that until everybody has their 3 servings. So
yeah, the etiquette behind a tea party, I learned very quickly, was not how me and my 3-year-old have a tea party, where it's haphazardly thrown around and like fake food is given to me in tiny pieces of cake. It's like you had to have the right linens and the right pot, and it had to be served properly. And you had to have the right teacups, and this whole etiquette of, you had to be sure that you were facing the sun in a certain way, depending on when you were having guests over. And it was a very Emily Gilmore-esque read for me to learn how to have a tea party. And I felt very overwhelmed, honestly. But you had to have all of the materials. So it's like the strainer, the linens, the sugar bowl, the tongs, the little teaspoons that you would have. And like me and Catherine having tea right now is a very casual moment, and we're talking amongst 30 of our closest friends. But this was like we say it was a very conversational event, but this was really like you were hosting, which is very scary to me. And there's full etiquette books, like Catherine was mentioning. I found one about specifically New York tea culture and how you were supposed to hold parties, and your etiquette of how you were supposed to invite somebody over and what you were supposed to do, and like what time of day was appropriate and who was going to have tea, because it was a social interaction, but it could be, it was mostly a feminine one, but it was always open to having men over too, which is really important because there's not a lot of spaces where men and women could mix together. So that's also really important to note. Yeah, absolutely interesting.
Yeah. So one of the things about this tea etiquette that I discovered is that one of the things about hosting a tea is, you know, it's kind of the pinnacle of politeness. And if you have people over, you're expected to serve them tea, and your guest is expected to then drink the tea. And sort of this clash of when, you know, two like very polite people are like, no, you first, that kind of thing. Where you're going to keep serving somebody tea until they say no thanks, but the other person is not going to say no thanks for the tea because that would be offensive, right? So there was this little trick that was common in America, apparently not so much in Europe, or at least not in France, where a lot of this comes from these French travel writers. So when you're done drinking tea, when you're visiting somebody's house, the way to signal that without actually saying anything is you turn your cup upside down in the saucer. And so, but a lot of these French travel writers didn't know this. And so they're drinking like 24 cups of tea. And this host is probably thinking like, oh my God, this person is like, because they don't know. And there was a story of one guy, he just like didn't know how to get his host to stop giving him tea. So he stuck his cup in his pocket.
Oh no.
And then somebody finally like told him, no, what you're supposed to do is just flip the teacup over.
Oh no.
And so I do have a photo that I like because it really shows a full tea service here. This is called the Tea Set. It's by a Swiss artist from about 1781. But you can see this is at the end of tea service. You see the teapot and the tea caddy behind it. So this would contain the tea leaves here. And you have your slop bowl, which is where you kind of throw things, you know, any tea leaves that kind of get in the cup or extra tea you don't want. You have your sugar bowl, your creamer, but then you see here all the teacups are flipped over. So people are done drinking their tea. So that's, yeah, there's all these little things that are very culturally specific that visitors didn't know, and then they get into these situations where they drink 24 cups of tea in a sitting.
That's a lot of tea. I saw a question come in and it reminded me of one of the Timothy Keeler ledgers that you have. Somebody asked, is tea relatively inexpensive now? Tea is relatively inexpensive now. Was it expensive during the colonial days? And we have, well, I shouldn't say we, Catherine, graciously looked through Timothy Keeler's ledger books and will be able to give us an insight as to like how much tea was, which is like one of the coolest documents in the world.
Yeah, so this is one of my favorite parts about doing Tavern Tastings is I really get to deep dive into these ledgers that we have in our collection. So I did find tea Timothy did trade a lot in tea. He was buying tea and in New York and reselling it here in Ridgefield. So one of the things you do need to know about the tea trade in the 18th century was that the British East India Company had a monopoly on trade in tea. So they were the only ones who could purchase tea in China and import it into Britain. And then from there, the tea cargo would be auctioned off to wholesalers. And then it would go to a retail setting, and then it would finally get to the consumer. So you can see there's like a lot of steps in there where the price of tea is going to go up and up and up. So I did mention before that tea was smuggled out of the Netherlands because the Dutch were not paying taxes on their imported tea while the British were paying a lot of taxes on their tea. So for a long time, you do get legal tea is going to be very expensive. Smuggled tea will be a lot less expensive. So what I have on the screen now is some purchase orders that of Timothy's, where he is purchasing goods in New York City from kind of retailers or wholesalers. I'm not exactly sure. Mary and I are both trying to figure out who these guys are who are actually selling to Timothy.
I will find that connection.
So these three documents here are purchase orders of items that Timothy is buying from Isaac and Andrew Koch in New York City. And you can see highlighted here are three instances where he's buying tea. So in 1789, he's actually buying that Souchong tea, which is the larger leaf tea. So this is really expensive. It's 10 shillings a pound, and he's only buying 1 pound of it. But in 1790 and 1791, he's buying a lot more, and it just says tea. So it's more likely that the Buhi tea I'm mentioning. So he's buying 30 pounds in one place and 21 pounds in 1791. And at this time, it's 2 shillings 10 pence per pound. So that's a lot less than that Souchong. But to compare, coffee at the same time is about 1 shilling 4 pence per pound. So about half the cost of tea. And this is Timothy purchasing it for his store. So then he's coming back to Ridgefield and reselling it to the folks of Ridgefield. So here are his ledger books from the store, and you can see the price of tea varies quite a bit. And luckily, people in Ridgefield do like their tea, so they were buying quite a bit of it. But you can see I do have 2 instances before the Revolution, and then we have after the American Revolution, where we kind of get away from this reliance or restriction of the British East India Company. So in 1772, tea is 5 shillings 4 pence per pound, and then in 1774 it's even more expensive. It's 6 shillings 6 pence, which is 6 shillings and 6 pence is about 2 days of work, like wages for about 2 days of work. So that's very expensive. And you can see after the Revolution, once we get into the 1790s, the cost of tea goes down dramatically, and it's about half of what it cost before the Revolution. So I do think it's fascinating, this fluctuation in the tea.
Legal tea starts a revolution, if we've learned anything. So. It is fascinating to see New York advertisements for tea, and then looking at Timothy Keeler and those ledgers and what was going on in his store and what Ridgefield was doing, and cost of living even in the 18th century and how much it changed. And I saw somebody else had asked a question about taverns, and Samuel Fraunces would have absolutely had tea. We were right by the harbor, so he would have had access to every place that Timothy would have been buying from and trading and bartering. And coffee and tea were popular beverages at the time because, again, little to no access to free and like clean water. So they would have been drinking tea and coffee and ale, and it's interesting. But I know that there's that connection, and I will be looking for it because I want to connect. I want to connect Fraunces Tavern to Keeler Tavern. I know it's out there. I know one month we're going to stumble on it and be like, oh, duh, this makes total sense now. I know it exists.
Yeah.
It'll be like kismet. But that did remind me of the tea water pumps that were around in the 18th century. This was another fun one that I had kind of stumbled upon. So lack of access to clean drinking water in New York City was a thing, and they would have their favorite kind of wells and ponds that they would use. And there was one specific one that had so many illustrations for it, which I thought was kind of weird. It was the Knapp's Tea Pump on Chatham, which today is like 10th, 11th, and like 14th Avenue and not 14th Avenue, 14th Street. So a ways up from Fraunces Tavern. And they would literally take the cleanest water, the freshest water that they could find, which was at this pump, and they would bottle it. And they would call it tea water pump, and they would literally go up and down the street and saying, you know, water for sale, tea water for sale. And it's honestly one of the most New York things, to bottle clean water and then sell it to have tea, to have another, like, I mean, remember, having tea is a very like sign of wealth and status. So to bottle water, to have a very fancy tea with all of your friends as like a middle class wealthy family is just like, it reads like a Seinfeld episode. Like I can see it happening, of like George Costanza not picking up the water and like Kramer getting like a crate of it or something like that. But it's really interesting to me. They would like sell it, and they were hot commodities. Like they weren't cheap because it was clean water and you were using it to make your tea, which was just as an expensive like thing to do. So, I mean, it's very funny. And then there was 1757, the Common Council passed a law for the regulating of tea water men in the city of New York because there were too many of them, and they started selling counterfeit water. So we've come full circle, and it's just, it reads like a Seinfeld episode every time I would look more into it. The engravings were really funny because they would have a guard or two stand around the tea pump to make sure that nobody was stealing it in the middle of the night as well. So I will leave people with that note. Take with that as what you'd like.
Yeah, I think part of the thing to know about tea is like tea, coffee, and chocolate all sort of came to Europe all at the same time. And they each kind of ended up finding their niche within society. So coffee became like a very public drink. You went to the coffee house if you were a man, you went to the coffee house to discuss politics and drink your coffee. And we kind of see that today. We always, ask people, hey, do you want to go out for a coffee? Even if you both end up getting like tea or whatever. So it's a public thing. Chocolate was a very domestic thing. It was like a woman's drink. And she would have it at home in private for breakfast, that kind of thing. And then tea found that sort of middle ground. It was a domestic setting. You usually had it in the home. You could have it in a tavern. It was available publicly, in public spaces, but it was generally this kind of, you have it in a domestic setting, but also in a social setting. So where you have those tea parties and things like that. So I do see Kay is asking, what is high tea? And was that an English thing or all over Europe? I do know it was kind of most popular in England, but elsewhere in Europe, they were having, it's basically afternoon tea. So the way your day sort of went, if you were a high society person, is you'd have your breakfast and then you'd go about your day, and then you have a big lunch, like your midday meal, which was normally called dinner. And then around 4 o'clock, you have your tea. This is when people are visiting each other. And then later in the evening, you'll have a small supper because you've already had like your snack, I guess, at tea. So high tea is usually about 4 o'clock, and that includes the tea, but also food, right? You also get food at high tea. In the 18th century, there would have been things like sweetmeats, cold pastries, cakes. Cracked nuts were like a big thing. You always had cracked nuts when you served tea. I don't know.
Don't question it.
And then low tea would have been kind of just tea, without all the extras happening around with it.
Yeah, it was heavier meals, I find, with high tea. That was like you were sitting down and it was like you were grabbing a bite to eat with somebody and having your tea, like a full meal.
Yeah.
Definitely interesting. I do love the etiquette. And then I found a sermon on tea, which I thought was going to be kind of Boston Tea Party related or New York Tea Party related, of he's a physician. So that was already off-putting because I was like, this doesn't feel like a sermon. And going back to how Catherine was saying that they're all like masculine and feminine spheres, he starts going on about tea drinking in a very misogynistic way. And I was like, I have to keep reading this because where did this come from? T, E, and A, he says, to the pernicious influence of tea, he attributes tattling, extravagance, and absurdity. Tea has caused people to lose height and strength, but more significantly, it has induced men into hysteria, a sickness once restricted to women, saying that if you were drinking tea, my translation was you turn into a lady. And then my favorite part of this was the British, he asserts, think a female army will protect tea drinking in the colonies. So I guess it was kind of Boston Tea Party revolution related, but it came at it from a very different angle that I was suspecting. So yeah, tea feminizes men. It's literally like a full sentence at the beginning of it. Very interesting, and it plays off of, where people were drinking tea, how they were drinking tea, who was leading these things, and coffee houses and tea parties and good things that make me glad that I live in 2021.
Yeah. The other thing that reminds me of is these kind of pamphlets that were written about tea early in the 1700s, when tea is still a little bit new. And tea, they talk about the medicinal properties of tea. And some of the things, so there's this publication from, I forget exactly, it's early in the 1700s, like 1720, I want to say. It's called Discourses on Tea. And so he goes over the whole history of tea and where tea comes from and how it's made and, yada, yada, yada. And then he has a whole section, it's about 30 pages on like the good medical uses for tea, right? And all these things it's going to cure. So let me see, there's some, what does it say? So it'll cure obstructions of the liver, the spleen, the pancreas, obstructions and inflammation of the lungs, difficulty breathing, dry, thick cough, excessive sweating, spitting of blood, disorders of the eye, surfeits, which are hangovers, all these things. And he also says, this is one of my favorite things. It says, he mightily recommends the use of tea to gentlemen of a sprightly genius who would preserve the continuance of their lively and distinct ideas. So, if you're a genius, you have to drink your tea. But then, so he goes on in about 30 pages of all the great things tea's going to do for you. And it's going to thin your blood so it can move through your brain better. And it's going to get rid of blood obstructions. And then he tacks on at the end a whole chapter on why tea's bad and bad for you. And then it's exactly the same thing. Like, so it was good because it cures obstructions of liver, spleen, pancreas. But then it says it's bad for people who have obstructions of the liver, the spleen, the pancreas. So I'm like, sir, make up your mind. But then at the very end, he has this, it's such a modern kind of thing. It's in 18th century English, but he basically says, these are the possible side effects of drinking tea: paleness, faint, discolored look, great coldness in the stomach, numbness of the hands, dimness of sight, lowness of spirit, loss of appetite, weakness. And then he basically, it's one of those like, on drug advertisements, right? These are the side effects. And if you notice, these stop use immediately, because he basically says, it's not possible to say beforehand with what healthy person's tea will disagree till they have used it. Where it disagrees, it should be immediately left off. So if you have any of these side effects, stop drinking your tea.
It's
But
just
I
pictures
did
like
think it was I was reading it and it was like such a modern kind of, these are the side effects of this drug.
I just pictured in my head like an 18th century drug advertisement of people like kayaking in like stays and breeches and stuff like that. Tea, to be clear, does not do that. Tea will not cure your hangover. I can guarantee you on that. Everything else is up for debate, but I don't think it's taken away a hangover. That's what Gatorade is for. Yeah, it's interesting because you read back and forth of when they first discover it, they're like, oh, this is great. It's going to cure everything. It's the best thing in the world. And then when we were going over documents, we were like, I found one that would dispute this. And then they said it was okay again. And it would go back and forth as to like medicinal properties, if it was good for you, if it was bad for you. And it's interesting to watch those social cues of like doctors arguing over the influence of tea and how it could save your life or possibly kill you. And it's like, oh gosh.
I just do like the fact that this is the same publication. Like he literally just like put the both of them together. It's
Terrible
gonna save your
editing.
life and it'll kill you. So
That's what copy editors are for. Should have saved it for the next one. That is, choices were made on that one. I wonder if the conversation that we're having was had at like a tavern or in somebody's house of like, what do you think we should do? They're telling us we should drink it, but they're also telling us it could kill us.
I'm sure it did. All right, so I think we have just a few minutes left in our time. So I want to let people know if you have any last questions, pop them in the chat so we can get them answered.
Oh yeah, learn more about the New York Tea Party because that happened. Some of it happened at Fraunces Tavern. The mob gathered at the tavern. That's what we've got on it. My one fun fact about the New York Tea Party is that unlike the Boston Tea Party, New Yorkers were so angry and outraged that they didn't do it in the middle of the night dressed up as other people. It was in broad daylight and nobody put on a disguise and they were like, what are you going to do about it? Nothing.
All right, I do see a question here. What kind of tea was on the ship for Boston Tea Party? That's a great question. So Boston Tea Party, there were actually 4 ships that were headed for Boston. One ship ran aground in Cape Cod, so it never made it to Boston, but the other 3 ships did make it to the harbor. And there were, hold on, I have the exact number. 2,000 chests, which is about 600,000 pounds. Oh no, that was a different one. Hold on.
So many tea parties, Catherine.
Yeah, 342 chests of tea were on all these three ships, which comes out to over 92,000 pounds of tea. Most of it was that buhi tea. There was some souchong tea, as well as Haisan, the green tea, the really expensive green tea. There were a couple of chests of that. So, and I believe there were also a couple of chests of the Congo tea as well. So Oliver Pluff and company, where I bought this tea, they're out of Charleston, but their website actually has a whole section on the history of tea where they list out like exactly how many chests of each tea were thrown overboard in the Boston Tea Party. And I think the Boston Tea Party Museum also has that information on their website as well. If you're interested, they have like detailed, accounts, and they have the, the shipping manifests and things like that. Because this was legal tea. These were British East India Company ships. So they were, they had to have all that documentation. So yeah, one of the things I think is really fun. So Boston was the center for legal tea in the 1770s, but New York was the center of smuggled tea. So I think about,
oh yeah,
and I think it's estimated 90% of all the tea drunk by Americans in the 1770s before the Revolution was smuggled.
I absolutely believe that statement.
Yeah, like 90%. That's a lot of tea.
It was cheaper. We know what we were doing mostly.
Yeah.
I will also say that the Boston Tea Party Museum is like a really good one in Boston. You get to go on the ship. There's live reenactments. You get to be part of the crowd, so all the kids will love it too. And then you get to like fake throw a chest of tea over, which is like every historian's dream in the 18th century. My husband thinks I'm crazy, but I was like, do it. Let's see what it looks like. It's going to be great. I think that's it for questions. I hope we answered everybody's questions. I hope everybody learned a few things tonight as well, because I know I did. Catherine's always a great, I don't know, you're just a great teacher sometimes. I learned so much from you.
Thanks. Well, I really hope that you you learned something and you were able to enjoy a nice cup of tea. And I hope you kind of found maybe a new tea you want to try. So I hope you join us again. January 11th is our next Tavern Tastings. We're going to be talking about desserts. So all different types of desserts that you could have in the 18th century. So that'll be a ton of fun. So make sure you join us for that as well.
We hope everybody has a safe and happy holiday. Be well, be safe, be healthy. Thank you all so much.
All right, so bye everyone.